So today we're going to talk about growth. So from encounter, we're not just left to stay there. We are called to be a people who walk faithfully as a response to that encounter, to walk faithfully with where God is calling us. So I wanted to take a look at the Gospel of John in particular, and some of the examples of apostles that we see in the big church upstairs with the statues there. What are a few examples from the lives of those apostles that help us to grow? Can someone hit my next slide real quick? So if we're going to jump into John's Gospel, I wanted to talk a little bit about it. This is the Catholic Biblical School presenting this today. And we want to take very seriously the study of Scripture. So grounding John's Gospel, I think, is a good place to start. So John's Gospel is potentially the strangest of the four Gospels. The other three are called synoptics because they have a degree of symmetry between them. But John's Gospel takes a different tact. At the beginning of John's Gospel, there isn't an infancy narrative. There's not a story of Jesus being born, but instead, there's a story of God's coming into our world from a cosmic perspective. This is one of the reasons why they have the four living creatures that are sometimes depicted as the four Gospels. And John's Gospel is the eagle, because it begins very high up. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We start way up high, and it tells the story of incarnation. It comes all the way down. In fact, in the liturgy, it's John's first chapter that is the Gospel for Christmas Day Mass. So I always say, Christmas is not just Jesus' birthday. It's a feast of the incarnation, the story of God's life coming into our life. God emptying himself in Jesus, adopting our life in all of its brokenness, so that we might be adopted into the life of God in all of its fullness. So John's Gospel starts a little bit differently. It also has unique content. There's a lot of content in John that isn't in other Gospels, and there's content that's in other Gospels that isn't in John. There's some chronological differences. John seems to build his narrative around the feast cycles of Israel. And so as you're digging into that, you'll notice that many things are happening in and around the great feasts of Israel. There's a lot of theological focus in John. Maybe most notably, there's a series of I am statements that Jesus makes that seem to be Christ's self-identification with God himself, which is pretty radical, which might explain why, at some occasions, as we'll talk about in a moment, Jesus finds himself threatened, stoned, or attempted to be stoned at one point, and ultimately crucified. You'll notice there are no explicit parables or exorcisms recorded in John's Gospel, but instead these I am statements function similarly as a way of identifying Christ's nature with things that we may comprehend ourselves. I am the light of the world. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. And finally, and maybe most importantly for our lesson today, John's Gospel was written by a figure that identifies as the beloved disciple, the disciple who Jesus loved. Now, we don't have time to dig into all of the scholarship and history on all of this stuff today. You could probably do a year-long session just on John's Gospel and the disciple that Jesus loved. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in doing that, to consider future courses in the biblical school. But I do want to make a note that in John's gospel, we will be talking about John himself, who I believe is the author of this book, and I believe there's good reason to believe he was. But John never comes out and says, "Hi, my name is John." He always refers to himself as the disciple who Jesus loved. And I think that gets down to the core, and we're going to come back to this after we've gone through everything else, the core of what growth looks like in the Gospel of John. It's growth towards something, and it's growth towards love. And it's growth that begins as well with love. So John's identity as a disciple is one who was loved and was called to love. And that's our origin as disciples of Jesus. And it's our destination as disciples of Jesus. So we want to be people who begin and end with love, not just any love. A new commandment, Jesus says in John's gospel, that you would love one another as I have loved you. A call to love, not like I love tacos, not even like I love my wife or my 5 boys, but a love that reflects God's very love, that eternal love, the love that pours out and flows and spirates into our world so that we might become partakers of the divine nature. Love from God and to God. So, we want to talk about growth. There's one final passage before we click to the next slide. I want to highlight because there is a very explicit place in John's gospel where he does talk about growth. And it's John 16:4, where it says, "As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me." So if we are called to love, which is a very high call, thankfully, we are not called to do it alone. There's one critical step in any growth that we might have in the spiritual life, and that is our connectedness to God. And that's what the incarnation is all about. God entering into our life. Because if we had to enter into God's life, if we had to ascend to heaven, we'd be in trouble. So God came down to us. He joined us where we are, us poor and lost sheep. So let's talk about some of the apostles that we see, the disciples in John's gospel. And I want to start with St. Andrew. You'll see him up there. He looks just like that. That's a picture of the statue upstairs. St. Andrew's an interesting guy. He has the name Andrew, which is not a Hebrew name. It's a Greek name. He may have had a Hebrew name, but if he did, we don't know it. Oftentimes you would have maybe a Hebrew name and a Greek name. You see that with Paul/Saul. Saul was Paul's Hebrew name, but as he adopted his mission to the Gentiles, he went by Paul. You also see that even with nicknames like Peter or Cephas in Greek, or as we'll see later, Thomas/Didymus, both meaning twin in Aramaic and Greek. But all we know for St. Andrew is his Greek name, and he's a really early disciple of Jesus. In fact, I'm going to read you a little encounter. They in the Eastern Catholic churches, they call him the Protokletos, which is a Greek term which means the first called. So in John's Gospel, in the first chapter, beginning at verse 35, we read, "The next day," this is after John identifies Christ. The first time, John was standing with two disciples, and he looked at Jesus as he walked and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." And the 2 disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. They didn't stick around with John. Jesus turned to them and said to them, "What do you seek?" And they said to him, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" And he said to them, "Come and see." They came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day, for it was the 10th hour. And one of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. So Jesus calls these two disciples right after John identifies him as the Lamb of God. And so the first two are Andrew and somebody.
Peter.
It wasn't Peter, because we'll see Peter gets called in a second. In this account, it's Andrew and somebody. And we don't know who somebody is in this account. It may be that somebody is John. But because Andrew is there, he gets called the first caller. So in this process of calling, we have Andrew. Now, he is the brother of Peter. And one of the things I find really interesting is that he has an encounter, and his first response is to go and tell others. Now, I did want to take a moment here. I put some little footprints in the background of this slide for the half of the room that has a screen that's functional. I think that it's really important that we take a moment to recognize that to be called by a rabbi, which is what Jesus is explicitly called here, is not a call to attend a class once a week. It was a call to reorient one's entire life. To reorient one's entire life. So if a rabbi came up to you and called you and said, "Follow me," which was the typical way that a rabbi might call somebody, the response to follow them would be to say, "From now on, I'm going to do everything like my rabbi does." Basically, I'm going to try to fit my feet into the footprints of my rabbi. If my rabbi eats with his right hand and sleeps on his left side, and he rubs his nose with his knuckle, I'll do all of those things. It's an emulation of life at its most specific. And so to respond to the call of Jesus is not intellectual assent, but it's a reorientation of one's entire life. So that's, I think, one of the key things. Abide in me, Jesus says. Abide in me. Is every part of your life connected to the vine? But then to respond, it's not a passive activity. We hear the gospel, and it begs itself. I don't know if you've experienced it, but it begs to be shared. Beth mentioned that we went to high school together. This was back before I was Catholic, but I remember we used to sit in front of the school every morning and pray by the flagpole. And people would come by, and I remember there's a lot of people who started to respond. I was somebody who responded in high school to that message. I was radically encountered by a living God, and suddenly I wanted to tell everybody about it. It was a passion. It was planted. I haven't gotten rid of it yet. I wanted to go out and share it. This news is so good. And if we respond in love, we want to share it. And Andrew does the same thing. He immediately goes, as we'll see in a moment here, he immediately goes and tells his brother about Jesus. There's a couple other places that Andrew shows up in John's gospel. Another one is in John chapter 6, which is the very chapter that we read in today's gospel. You went to Mass beforehand. And in that story, which is the culmination of the feeding of the 5,000, at the beginning, there's this problem where there's a crowd of hungry people and no seeming solution. And I love Andrew's response in that moment. And we'll get into that more in a little bit. But Andrew's response in that moment is to bring the fish. He finds it and brings it to Jesus. It's a act of doing something. Sometimes the problems of our world can seem pretty big, and there's a temptation. I think maybe it's a demonic temptation, a temptation to say, well, it's too big, so I won't do anything. If there's anything if there's any quote from a saint, I should probably like get tattooed on the inside of my eyelids. I think it's Teresa of Calcutta is known for it. She may have been the origin, but there are no great things, only small things with great love. So St. Andrew brings that forward in this case. It's a small thing that he does. He recognizes what he can do, which is different than we'll see with his buddy Philip. So even though the problem seems insurmountable, he brings what he can, and God's grace makes up the difference. So part of growing in faith is recognizing that God has not placed the burden of all the world's problems on our shoulders. He's taking care of that. But he is inviting us into the story. He's inviting us into the story to walk with him, to love like him, to be his hands in the world. And that's really what growth is. If you're trying to recognize what is alive, one of the early Greek philosophers said, well, if it has a sensory response, it's a good indication that something's alive. If you poke it and it moves, it's alive. So I want to ask, in growth, are we developing sensory responses to God's grace in our life? And one of those things is, are we hearing as we hear Jesus calling? Are we speaking? Are we touching? And St. Andrew responds in all of those ways. Another thing that he does, which I think is really amazing, in John chapter 12, there's a group of Greeks that come forward. They talk to Philip, and then Philip brings along Andrew. And I think they're maybe attracted by the Greek names of these guys, or maybe where they're from. And they're asking to see Jesus. And so this is a form of intercession. When someone has a need, sometimes they don't feel like they can go directly to God. And we have the privilege in many cases of doing it for folks. One of the most powerful questions that you can ask somebody is there something I can pray for you for? And sometimes you can do it right there with them. I would encourage you, as you're thinking about what does it mean to grow in God, it means how do we help connect people to God? Because a living thing is connected. So as we're trying to bring people into the life of God, we can actually function, as St. Andrew does in this story, as mediators. And St. Andrew can continue to be a mediator for us. It's a wonderful thing about saints and their intercession. And then finally, I just wanted to share a little bit about why does he have those two sticks sticking out of the back of his back there. St. Andrew continued to grow in Jesus. Jesus rose from the dead, and we see St. Andrew as one of the group of the 11 that gathers. They bring forth Matthias, and they continue the mission. And the tradition says he ministered probably around the Black Sea area. I don't have time to get into all the potential nooks and crannies where Andrew showed his face, but the tradition emerged, and whether or not this is true or not, I can't say, but the tradition emerged that he ultimately was crucified. And he was crucified on an X-shaped cross. The idea being, Christ was crucified on a regular shaped cross. And his brother gets crucified on an upside down cross. So to further differentiate himself, it's maybe an act of humility. There's the X-shaped cross. So that's why you see St. Andrew with an X-shaped cross. There's also theological significance to it, because in Greek, the word Christos begins with a chi, which looks to us like an X. So you could say it's not an X-shaped cross, it's a chi-shaped cross. But that's a little bit of the background of St. Andrew. And let's move on to the next guy. So Andrew goes and tells his brother, Peter, and we're not going to cover him today, but he's a big deal. And then, so I'll read you the story as it continues. Philip, let's see. He first found his brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which is translated Christ, which then we need to translate again, which means the anointed one. And he brought him to Jesus, and Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which is translated Peter. And the next day, he decided to go to Galilee, and he found Philip, and Jesus said to him, "Follow me." Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Okay. I want to get into a little bit of biblical exegesis here, which means let's look at the text itself. There's actually some semantic ambiguity in that final 2 verses. It says that the next day he decided to go to Galilee, but we don't know who he is. He might have been Jesus, or he might have been Peter. For the sake of our time today, let's explore what it might be like if John said he, meaning Peter. I'm not saying that's the way it is. Honestly, I could flip a coin on it and go either way. It's not going to decide our salvation in one way or the other, what the pronoun refers to in this case. But if it was indeed Peter who then went and found Philip, it would make some sense. Why? Well, Philip was from the same town, Bethsaida, as Andrew and Peter. So Bethsaida was not a big town. These folks would have known each other. So there's a relational network that already existed between Philip and Peter. And so Peter, if Peter is indeed the he, would have continued this train where see Andrew tells Peter, and then Peter tells Philip, and then Philip, we'll see, will come and tell somebody else. So it does create that kind of a chain. Is that really important? Maybe not. But I do think it is important that we recognize that God doesn't usually call us first and foremost to tell strangers about him. Usually, it makes the most sense that we tell people that we know. When I became a follower of Jesus, I didn't immediately buy a plane ticket to Tijuana. I told the other people in my high school, and in my family, in my neighborhood, the friends that I had, and that's a lot more effective in my experience. In fact, I will tell you a quick story about how I was a miserable failure as an evangelist for many years. So I encountered this Jesus in my life, and I wanted to tell everybody about it. I wanted to tell everybody about the gospel. And so I had some friends, and we decided what we're going to do is we're going to just preach the gospel to as many people as we can. So I used to go like knocking door to door, and I would say to people, "Hey, if you were to die tonight, do you know where you'd go?" And they'd be like, "Get out of here, man." I would have maybe Bible tracts with me, and I'd meet somebody on the street. I'd say, "Here, I want you to have this Bible tract. It tells you the story of God." And they said, "Thanks, but no thanks." Throw it directly in the garbage. I even would go down to the University of Michigan or to Eastern Michigan University with some of my friends, and we'd like stand on milk crates. And as people like were trying to get to class, we just like proclaim the kerygma at them. And so I did a lot of things to try to share the gospel. And I never had a single person ever say, "You know what? You're right." I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but God never gave me that grace. God never gave me that grace. But in the moments of my life where I've been a part of somebody's life, where they know who I am, they know that I care about them. And because of that, my love of God kind of flows out. I've seen a lot of people say, "There's something different about you. What is it?" Scripture says we always want to be prepared to give a reason for why we have hope. So I think Philip's call, it makes some sense that he's the next guy, because he was a guy who was connected to Peter and to Andrew. And so what do we see in Scripture that happens with him? He's called, maybe by Jesus, well, definitely called by Jesus, but maybe Peter is an intermediate figure there. And then he goes on and he finds another fellow named Nathanel, who we'll talk about in a minute, and tells him about Jesus. So the progress continues. And then in that same passage where we saw Andrew bring the fish, before that, it says that Jesus is going to ask Philip about what they should do. So Jesus already knows what he's going to do, it says. He wants to test Philip in particular. I don't know how Philip gets the designation of getting asked the hard question. And I know how this works. So, maybe the planning team here had a similar discussion. We're going to have a room full of people. Where are we going to get the food? And thankfully, the answer was like, I don't know, Costco or something. I'm not sure where it all came from, but it was great. We had a solution here. But they're out in the middle of nowhere. There's no money. There's no food. Jesus comes up to Philip, and Philip answers basically, I don't know. I don't know. So is that unfair? It's unfair. Well, I think Jesus is trying to train Philip to do something. Andrew responds in one way, which is he recognizes an opportunity for grace, even if it's small, and responds. I think one of the things that Jesus is trying to do with Philip here is to say, I want you to open your eyes to a God that's bigger than your understanding. I think one of the fundamental rules of growth is for God to open our eyes to see where he's at work, not just what we can recognize on our own. To have eyes that are open. So this is another sense of the kingdom that can help us indicate spiritual growth, is that we begin to see God in our world. We begin to recognize the places in our world where God is at work. One of the most amazing things is I've never walked into a place where I beat God there. I'm never introducing God to someone for the first time. God's already there. He's already at work. He's already calling people. He's already loving people. He's already showing him his grace and mercy. He's already revealing his nature to people. We're the dunces that don't know what's going on. So if we have eyes to see, we can respond to the opportunities of grace, not limited by our own self, but recognizing maybe the small, gracious ways, the loaves and the fishes that we might have to participate in some small way with the great work that he's doing. So when you go to the grocery store, I guarantee you, somewhere in that building, someone is at a critical point in their life, in their relationship with God. Maybe God will show them to you, maybe they won't. But are we open to seeing the opportunities that we have? And that can go anywhere. My wife sometimes gets upset with me because I'll go out to get gas and then wind up in a 2-hour conversation with somebody about Jesus. It doesn't happen often, but we want to be open to those conversations that can happen. We want to be open to, oh my goodness, someone came up, they talked, and so having eyes to see. So Philip is being trained in this story to start to see Jesus. And I think he starts to get it. I think he starts to get it. And I'll tell you why in a second. But he's also the person who goes with Andrew to tell Jesus about the Greeks seeking him. And I love his response in this case. So originally in John chapter 12, this is during Holy Week, the Greeks come and say, we'd like to see Jesus. And Philip's response is incredible. He doesn't just introduce them himself. He grabs a friend He grabs his friend Andrew, and the two of them do it together. And I think this is a great way of recognizing that our life with God is never something that is a solo endeavor. I put up there, seeking the Father in the beloved community. Philip, every time you see him, it's like he's reaching out for relationship, reaching out to involve more people in it. Our growth is not just me and Jesus. We're meant to be disciples in the plural, not disciple. We're called to be disciples, which means that I need other people. The Apostle Paul talks about the body of Christ, which is another great image, like the vine of a living thing. But he talks about it in terms of having different members. There's hands and there's feet, and each thing has its own role and purpose. So we want to be connected to others, and Philip demonstrates that. Finally, in terms of scripture passages, Philip asks Jesus to show them the Father. So I think he starts to recognize there's some way that I can't see, but that I could see. And the person who can show me is Jesus. Jesus' response to him, if you've seen me, you have seen the Father. So he opens his eyes. Oh my goodness, the thing that God has been doing, the greatest thing in all of history, has been in front of me this entire time. He begins to be open to having his eyes see what God is doing. Okay, a couple final things. He is said to have been martyred probably in Hierapolis. The great tradition of the church tends to say he was crucified. But that's most of what we know about Philip. There is some confusion. I put confusion in his mission because there is a Philip that does a bunch of other stuff in the Bible. In the gospel, or not the gospel, in the book of Acts, we see a Philip who reaches out to this Ethiopian eunuch who, as he miraculously appears, and he's doing mission up in Samaria. And so is that the same Philip? Well, no. In Acts 6, we see that there's, in addition to the apostles, 7 other men who are called to be the first deacons. And there is one of those deacons that's name is Philip, and he's the one who's doing that stuff. And so there is a bit of confusion if you try to do historical research on like what happened to the Philips. They often get confused with one another because even like the first generation of Christians got confused. I mean, the second generation of Christians got confused about which Philip did what. So there's a lot of stuff that Philip could have done, but it might have been the other Philip, and vice versa. So just to keep that in mind. But the one thing that is true in the testimony of all the churches, he lived his life continuing to proclaim Jesus Christ, crucified and resurrected, and was able to spread that message all over the known world at the time. Next guy, someone able to click the computer. Awesome. Nathaniel, maybe my favorite guy. This is my guy. I don't know why I love him so much. So Nathaniel is the next one who is told about Jesus. And it's this fascinating story. I'll read it to you in a second here, but I did want to make sure that we talked about why is he called Nathaniel in John's gospel? But usually people think he's the same guy that's called Bartholomew in the Synoptics. And I do think he's the same guy. Like I said, there's plenty of information that we can talk about with that. But Nathaniel, Nathan, meaning gift, of El, that's a word for God, gift of God, similar to Matthew. And also Jonathan, Nathan, that's the proper name of God, plus the same root, meaning gift of Yahweh. But that's his first name. It's not a super common first name. But then Bartholomew is a Hebrew indication of his patronymic, which is a big fancy word that means who his dad was. So his dad was Ptolemy, and Bar means son of. So Bartholomew is basically his last name, maybe. I mean, in the way that we think about last names. His name would have been Nathaniel, son of Ptolemy, Nathaniel Bartholomew, right? So that's where the name comes from. He's from a place called Cana, which is the first of the guys we've looked at that's not coming from a fishing village, maybe a farming village. And that's just speculation. But they go up to Cana, and for some reason, and I think it might be that wedding feast that we hear about in a minute. Well, we won't hear about it today. But if you read John's Gospel, Jesus' first recorded miracle in John's Gospel happens in a city called Cana. They go to a wedding, and Jesus makes sure the party doesn't stop. So, what do we do? What we do see is that Nathaniel is called in a very interesting way. I'm going to read it to you. It says, Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found him of whom Moses and the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Ugh. Philip said to him, "Come and see," which is a great response. It's a great response. Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him and said to him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no guile." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, where you were under the fig tree, I saw you." And Nathanael said, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." And then Jesus goes on to say, "You think that's impressive? You're going to see the angels ascending and descending from heaven." So what? That's a strange story, huh? It's a strange story. He's sitting under a fig tree, and he's approached by Philip. So Philip then continues to share. So that train of sharing to sharing to sharing to sharing. This is not, the fourth generation, if you will, comes, and Nathanael's sitting under a fig tree. Now, why would someone sit under a fig tree? Fig trees are nice, but they also had a role in the ancient Near Eastern Jewish life. If you read rabbinic literature, it says that the rabbis would rise early and gather their disciples and sit under the fig tree to study Torah. Now, why would they do that? Well, there's a couple things. Like, fig tree is a really interesting symbolic thing in Israel. Number one, it matures slowly. And so in some cases, there's one person a rabbi was planting a fig tree, and someone said, "Are you ever going to live to see those figs and eat those figs that are growing?" And he says, "Well, I'm not planting it for me. I'm not planting it for me." They also ripen slowly. They ripen slowly over about 3 months, and they ripen sporadically. So that's one of the reasons that the rabbis like to sit under the fig tree, is they would say, like these figs that ripen slowly one at a time, so Torah ripens slowly. We had to continue to sit and meditate on it. So if Nathanael's sitting under a fig tree, there might be good reason to believe he's meditating on Torah. What's Torah? The 5 first books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. In that first book, there's a story of a guy who comes to be known as Israel. And so Jesus says to him, "Israelite in whom there is no guile." I think that's the background here. I don't have time to get into all of it, but this guy, Jacob, was a deceiver. He eventually gets a new name, Israel, in which he's hopefully progressing towards having a little bit less deception. So an Israelite in which there is no guile, there's no deception. So he's recognizing maybe Israel as he's supposed to be, not Jacob as he was. But Jacob as he was, after he deceived his brother, was fleeing and had a vision of angels ascending and descending. So if I was going to guess, I would guess that Nathaniel is sitting under the tree, meditating on Torah, and maybe meditating very much on this story in the Torah about Jacob, his deceit, his vision, his journey with God. And then Philip comes along and says, you know that thing that Torah was telling us about? That promise that started with the books of Moses, the Torah, and then was confirmed through the prophetic witness? It's happening. It's happening right now. And Nathaniel has maybe a kind of a jerk response. Like, how can anything happen good from Nazareth? Philip just says, come and see. And to Nathaniel's credit, he overcomes his prejudice and allows his curiosity to lead him forward. So what we see is, this is a really important piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of things that could hold us up. There's a lot of things that could hold us up from responding to God's grace. Nathaniel shows us one way that we can be growing in God so that we don't miss it. And what's that? He was deeply embedded in the story of God, what God had been doing and what God promised to do. So this is maybe the sense of having our ears open to the story of God. Are we spending time in prayer? Are we spending time in contemplation? Are we spending time reflecting on Scripture as we're doing today? Good job, everybody. Are we spending time hearing the story of God so that when we're called into the next act of it, because God's story isn't over yet, that hopefully we can recognize, oh my gosh, God's doing something today. And I know it because I've been listening to the storyteller for a long time, and I recognize his hand. Okay? So Nathaniel tells us about that. He does go on to missionary journeys, and it doesn't end super pleasantly for him. The tradition that you'll see him upstairs with a knife in his hand. That's because the tradition is that he gets flayed alive. It's his skin cut off, and in some cases, his head cut off too. So that's how you'll recognize him upstairs. Is he's got the knife. If you actually, as an aside, if you look at Michelangelo's depiction of him in the Sistine Chapel, he's there holding his own skin, and a lot of people think that Michelangelo put his own face on that skin. So like that's the self-portrait in the picture. I don't know why I did that, but interesting. Okay, next one. Okay, we're done. Okay. All right. We got two more apostles. We're going to knock it out in 5 minutes. It'll be amazing. Thomas. He is an amazing guy too. There's three scriptures that are in here that I wanted to highlight. We know him first as appearing. We don't know exactly how he gets called. There's no calling narrative in John's gospel or anywhere really. But we do see him at an encounter with Lazarus. In John chapter 10, Jesus is in the temple and he makes some I am proclamations, and they attempt to stone him, and he leaves. He goes to Bethany. And then, or he leaves Jerusalem, and he's hanging out. I think it goes up to Galilee. So he leaves the area, but he's got some friends down in Bethany that are named Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And they hear word that Lazarus is dying. And finally, that Lazarus has died. And at this point, Jesus decides to go and see Lazarus. He says he's only sleeping. And everyone's like, okay. He's like, no, don't worry. You're going to see God. You're going to see God do something here. So Thomas is a little bit skeptical of how good this is going to turn out, but he still follows Jesus. So he goes, okay, well, we might as well go and die with him. And so that's where we first can hear Lazarus' voice in John's gospel. Jesus says, I'm going back down into Judea. Even though they tried to stone me there recently, but I'm going to go see Lazarus. And Thomas says, well, let's go die with him. Let's go die with him. So he's bold. He's courageous. He maybe speaks things out loud that Everyone else is keeping to themselves. I don't know if you know anybody like this. No filter. That's Thomas for you. Another one is Jesus during his Last Supper discourse, before he's betrayed and dies, tells him he's going to his Father's house to prepare a place. And Thomas is like, well, we want to go with you, but we don't know the way. Which is another example of like, maybe I would have, with my own pride, been like, oh yes, we will, the way or whatever. But he's no, brass tacks. I want to know, like, what's the way? How do we get there? You're going somewhere. I want to follow you. I said I'm going to follow you to death. Now you're saying you're going to your Father's house to prepare a way. How do I get there? And then Jesus turns to him and says, I am the way, which I think is great. And then the most famously, he's known for doubting Jesus' resurrection, which is fair, because I think that everybody would have doubted it. He just happened to not be the guy who was there at the time. And I actually think he maybe has one of the more heroic acts of faith in this moment, because when he does see Jesus and Jesus offers for him to put his hands in his side and his hands, he just responds, my Lord and my God. That demonstration of seeing Jesus calls forth an incredible declaration. This is not just the Messiah. This is God. This is my Lord. This is my God. So I think one of the things we have to learn from Thomas is don't be afraid to open your mouth. Don't be afraid to open your mouth. I would rather make a fool for myself for Jesus than to be considered wise and erudite and to let other people around me make their merry way towards hell. Let's be people who don't fear looking a little bit foolish, maybe, or not having a filter, maybe. Thomas gives us permission. There's a path to holiness that's blunt, it's inquisitive, loud and vocal. But ultimately, the last projection that he says is perhaps the most profound projection any apostle ever made. My Lord and my God. Pretty awesome. He is said to have been killed by a spear in India, so you'll see him often holding a spear. Finally, John. Oh my goodness. If you want to click forward to the next one real quick. John, we could spend, like I said, probably a year going over everything that he does. I'm going to stick to three things, and I want to focus on one. You see the heart in the background there. Love is the center of John's life. He's, like I said, the beloved disciple, very intimate relationship with Christ. So Christ loves him, but then calls him to love in maybe the most remarkable way, which is he gives him his mother and says, I want you to love like me. And I want you to love like me in maybe the most personal way anyone has ever loved like me, which is to love my mother. And that's a mission that we have too. So called from love to love. And I bet you Mary taught him how to love too. Like that would be an amazing school, because the tradition is that they lived together until Mary died. Imagine waking up and having coffee with Mary. Now, coffee hadn't been discovered yet, but imagine what that would look like. To be able to have that kind of a tutor in their life, to learn how to love. We also see that he's a witness to the resurrection. Jesus is he's a witness to the empty tomb in John's gospel. Mary Magdalene tells him that the tomb is empty. He runs with Peter to get there. I think it's really funny that he mentions that he won in the gospel. He's like, well, we ran there, I won, but I let Peter go in first. I just think that's a funny aside. But I think the heart and the soul of it is that he's somebody who learned how to run, or who learned how to love. He also was apparently good at running. But I wanted to read you something that Jerome records. Jerome's one of the early fathers of the church. And in his commentary of Galatians, he talks about John's last days, because John was probably the last apostle to die. And we have stories of him living in Ephesus. They tried to kill him with poison. So you'll see him like holding poison. That's the tradition, but it didn't work. So he's holding the poison, but he actually lives a long life. We don't have time, like I said, to get into all the details, but it's said that he finally did die in Ephesus, surrounded by the people in the church, which included a guy named Polycarp, who you might read about later. So Polycarp, the church father, was a personal disciple of John, but this other church father, Jerome, says John the Evangelist lived in Ephesus until extreme old age. His disciples could barely carry him to church, and he could not muster the voice to speak many words. During individual gatherings, usually he said nothing except for this: little children, love one another. The disciples and brothers got annoyed because they always heard him say the same words. So finally they said, Teacher, why do you always say that? And he replied with a line worthy of John: Because it's the Lord's command, and if kept alone, it's enough. It's enough. If kept alone, it's enough. Growth is from love and to love. Let's be sensitive, eyes open to see the kingdom like Philip, ears attentive like Nathaniel to hear the story of God. Let's blurt out like Thomas the hope that we have. Let's, like Andrew, do the small things that we can to help others and to play our part in the story of God. And like Andrew and Philip, to intercede, to bring people to the heart of God, that they might be loved and, by being connected to the vine, become love for the life of the world. All right, thank you.